Mm.
Welcome to Hot Off the Press, the show about authors and the books they bring to us. So before we start, let's go around the room and have everyone introduce themselves. Let us know a little about you. We'll go ahead and start with you, Jason.
My name is Jason Gilbert. I wrote the Clockworks of War series, and I also am currently writing the Clockworks. Yeah, it's late. The Coldstone Files under Falstaff Books. It is about the son of the Wolfman. It's a police procedural with a werewolf who is occasionally beaten by his best friend with a rolled newspaper for being a bad dog.
All right, thank you. Theresa.
I think Theresa is frozen in time.
It looks that way, so we'll just move on to you, John, here for a second while Theresa hopefully gets it sorted out.
Alrighty, I'm John Hartness, and I am the co-founder and publisher of Falstaff Books and the editor of the Coldstone Case Files by Jason Gilbert, which, yes, it is a police procedural, a fact that I continue to remind him of in said edits. I also write a few things, most notably the Black Knight Chronicles, the Bubba the Monster Hunter series of short stories and novellas, and the Quincy Harker Demon Hunter novellas and novels. The most recent of which, Conspiracy Theory, should be coming out. It's available for pre-order whenever you watch this, unless you watch it after October 15th, in which case you can have it in your hot little hands.
All right,
And just
perfect.
to show you even more of Hartness's talent, he is doing this while editing book 4 of Coldstone at the same time. Don't know how the man does it.
Well,
Like,
I'm also
seriously.
editing book 1 of Stuart Jaffe's high fantasy detective trilogy at the same time.
Hell no. I don't know how you do it, dude. I'm one of those. I told you when I sold you the series, when you were gracious enough to buy it from me, it was like, I can do one project at a time. I can't work on multiple things. And John, his response was, okay, cool.
Yeah.
And I sent him all 4 novellas, got the edits back on the first one, rewrote the entire series, wrote the other 3, and got it back, and he was totally cool about it.
Yeah.
She's back.
I can edit multiple things at one time, and I can write a little bit on multiple things at one time, but it's harder for me to edit and write a novel at the same time. Like right now, I'm also working on a short story for an anthology that Eastbeck Books is putting out, and I can do a short story while I'm editing other people's stuff, but that's about that, plus the run a company kind of thing is about all I can manage at one time.
All right.
But hey, Theresa, who are you?
Go you, dude.
Yep. Introduce yourself and what you're going to be talking about today.
She's
My name is Theresa. My name is Theresa Glover, and I'm the author of the Caitlin Kelly Monster Hunter series with Falstaff Books, and I am also an editor at Falstaff Books. And the book that I just recently had come out is called Trouble in Mind. It is the 3rd of the Caitlin Kelly Monster Hunter books, and I'm very excited about it.
All right, perfect. So let's go ahead and get into it with our books. So I'll start with you, John. Tell us about the new release and where the idea for the Harker series came from.
So this is the 7th volume of the Quincy Harker Demon Hunter series, and I started writing novellas in the Quincy Harker world in 2015 because I remembered seeing a commercial for Constantine on NBC. And I thought to myself, well, there's no way that that's going to be any good, because I'm a fan of the old comic books, Hellblazer, which Constantine is the protagonist of, and I grew up loving Hellblazer. I was in college, but I was a big Hellblazer fan in the 90s when Garth Ennis and Steve Dillon were creating that series, and with the spectacular painted covers by Glenn Fabry. And all I could think when I saw that NBC was going to do a Constantine TV series was, that's going to suck. You can't say f on network television. So I was right. It was decidedly mediocre, although Matt Ryan was a brilliant John Constantine and continues to be so on Legends of Tomorrow to this day. But I thought, I will show them and the world what an American John Constantine should be like. So I put my spin on it, and that's where Quincy Harker originated. He is a canonical character in Dracula lore. He's the son of Jonathan Harker and Mina Murray. And his actual name, and I typically screw up the order, Jonathan Quincy Abraham Holmwood Harker. He's named after all 4 of the men who were in the party hunting down Dracula in the novel. So, and yeah, that was my cat. So Quincy Harker is a character that was, as an infant, created by Bram Stoker way back in the day. But one, Stoker didn't register the copyright correctly in the United States, so Dracula's public domain. And 2, he'd been dead a long time. He don't care. So that's where the original idea came from. And I wrote them as 4 novellas a year for the first 4 years. And that collected volumes 1 through 4. And then I switched over to novels, and I do about 2 novels a year in the series now. So this is the 7th volume, as it were.
And what is conspiracy theory?
Conspiracy theory is the center of a 3-book plus 4 novella 2-year crossover arc between the Bubba the Monster Hunter series and the Quincy Harker Demon Hunter series. It started with, well, it was hinted at in Carl Perkins' Cadillac, which was book 5, but it really kicked off in Inflection Point, which was the 6th book in the Harker series. And starting in season 5 of Bubba, the first 2 of those are currently available. And I've been dropping in bits that tie back to the Harker books, moving towards an eventual crossover in Bubba season 5, volume 4, and Harker 8. Because I didn't have enough to do, so I decided to take 2 theoretically disparate fictional universes and mash them all together, which only involves, oh, I don't know, about 14 ongoing series of novels, novellas, and short stories across a dozen authors or so.
All right. So
it's a good thing you have a Melissa to keep it all straight for you.
You ain't wrong.
All right, Jason.
The Cold Stone Files was, and John will probably say this is fitting with the tone of the series, was kind of a brain fart. Of what if the main character was a werewolf who, unlike other werewolf characters who are tortured by their curse of being a wolf, he's good with it. What he's not good with is that he's the son of the notorious Wolfman killer who murdered multiple people around their hometown before he was killed off. So he's got different struggles going on. Originally, it was I had pitched it to John as being in the Quincy Harker universe. Once he read through it and made some changes, he decided that it would be a better fit on its own. So I equate it more to Psych on USA, but Sean's a werewolf and Gus is a cop. And then Hartness decided you need to watch Criminal Minds, because some of the direction that you try to go in the story, but you keep pulling back from. I think if you kept the tone you have with the horror comedy, but looked more at the procedural side of it that Criminal Minds can give you, you can go somewhere with this. And that's how season 1 in its entirety came through. So while book 1 is very buddy cop, book 2 and book 3 start veering towards that procedural side of things. So instead of James and Lacey saying, you meet Lacey in the second book, saying, hey, let's do this, and Philip goes, okay. It's, hey, let's do this, and Philip goes, okay, dude, that's not how real life works. You don't get results. You're not going to get your DNA results in an hour. So now, instead of saying, okay, well, Criminal Minds, they get their DNA results in an hour, I look at it and go, okay, it's going to take them a week to get their DNA results, and that's rushing it. That's putting it at the top of the list. So
in a novel, that's rushing it.
Yeah. So what's
3 months is rushing it.
Right. So what's a better way for James and Philip to figure things out? And that's where the advantage of having a supernatural element comes in. I get to explore, the wolf side of James has a very Viking lean to him. And then in the next book, you're going to see some Native American lore starting to come in, and you start finding out in the book that just came out, Wolf Song, you start finding out about the vampire houses and their influence in the United States. Now, I don't go super deep, like you're not going to get a whole chapter on vampire politics, to hell with that. But you will read it and understand that there is an element in the background. James, like I said, he's a werewolf. He's good with it. He can shift whenever he feels like it. But he's not completely immune to the full moon. So when the full moon hits, he has to plan on what he's going to do, because he cannot help the change and he can't shift back till it's over. He was left his father's fortune. He's a billionaire, but for him, it's not, I'm going to live lavishly. It's a tool that he uses to function, to buy food and rent his apartment, and that's it. And he uses his money about like your dad would use a screwdriver. But then once he gets caught up in something that's bigger than him, over the course of the books, you start to see him appreciate things more and see him develop from a guy who's just, okay, yeah, this is the way it is, to thinking more outside of the box than he usually does. And he becomes more sentimental to people outside of his normal circle, because in the first book, the only person he's really loyal to is Philip, fiercely loyal to Philip. But then as he builds his circle, he finds his loyalties expanding. And then at one point, he's going to find his loyalty seriously challenged. And you're going to see that in the fourth book. And that's as far as that goes, because I want you to read it and stuff.
Perfect.
And
all right,
I'm still editing it, so.
Yeah. And John likes it. That should tell you something right there.
But I have terrible taste.
This is fair.
all right. So Theresa, how about you?
Okay, so Caitlin began at the bar, of course. I think we had gone to some event at Park Road Books, and we were talking about writing stuff and all kinds of authorial, wonderful things. And John was talking, well, obviously.
Drinking is always part of things.
After we went to the bar, as we do, because we're writers, and John was talking about how he was playing with the idea of opening up the Bubba the Monster Hunter universe to some of his writer friends, just to see what they could do with it, see what other points of view it could get in. And I was sitting there and I was like, well, I've read all the Bubba the Monster Hunter books and I really liked them. And I think of myself as a decent writer. So as we were sitting there chugging through a cider or beer or whatever, I very tentatively pitched him an idea. And he's like, send me some chapters. And so Caitlin started at the bar. And she's very different in tone to the Bubba the Monster Hunter universe because I just sound a little more like his Quincy Harker universe. So she's kind of like the half-breed. She battles monsters like Bubba, but she's snarky as hell like Quincy.
So John,
Kind of one of the reasons that the universe is blended, because after book 1, I didn't want to rebrand it as a Harkerverse title, but the tone doesn't fit the Bubbaverse titles at all. And I was like, well, I basically have used the same magic and monster lore in both series just because I'm too lazy to try and keep multiple sets of lore straight. So we can just make it be one universe.
So yeah, I kind of made the multiverse flex, and it became a universe. But one of the things that I really appreciated that we were talking about that night was John wanted to see different parts of the country represented in the Bubba the Monster Hunter universe. And I had just recently come back from New Orleans. And as people who have been there know the history of New Orleans, that's a pretty wild town. And I had done all the nerdy tours and I was ready to write something in that city. So I started book 1. It was not exactly what I had pitched to him, but I started to realize that in playing with the local lore, I had to keep somebody there who was a tourist and was not a native and would probably never become a native, because that's one of those cities that you just can't accurately write unless you live there and breathe that city. And I didn't think that I could do it justice. So Caitlin is a tourist in New Orleans-ish. She has a job there, so she might be becoming a little more native, but it's never going to be born and bred. And as a part of that, one of the things that I really wanted to play with Caitlin was representing mental health and looking at all the ways we can be broken and persevere through it. So I wanted to really take Caitlin's baggage and sprinkle it through and show that we're all a little wounded and we all have our own battles that we're fighting, and it's not going to keep us down even though we may crack pretty hard at some points. And that's one of the reasons that I'm really proud of book 3, Trouble in Mind. I kept joking that it was the book that was going to kill me because it took a really long time for me to get it out. And even once I had the edits back, it took way longer than it should have because I really wanted to show what it's like to struggle with something and still try to keep fighting and be that badass, ass-kicking person that the rest of the world sees as fine, even though they're not.
Perfect.
So John, in the next Quincy Harker book, a character has to call him Quincy the Quincy the Harker.
Yeah, well, it's late. I've done a couple of panels today and I've been on Zoom
Dude,
most of the day.
I am right there with you, man. I am right there with you.
All right, so moving on to the next question I have, and I'm going to start with you, Jason. These are all series. Is there a difference in your writing, in your procedure process, whatever, when you're trying to write a standalone novel as opposed to a series? Now, I know a series is more, accepted and useful in the publishing world, but if you're doing a standalone, is there a difference in your procedure?
I'm going to say yes, mostly because it has been so many years since I've tried to write a standalone novel. And to be perfectly honest, I find myself incapable because I was that kid coming up, a standalone novel would piss me off because I wouldn't want that universe to end. I liked those characters and I would want to move on. Which is, I'm surprised I read as many Stephen King books in elementary and middle school as I did, because even back then I was a big Edgar Allan Poe fan who wrote standalone short stories, the bastard. But for me, I like to be able to end a story that I'm reading or watching and go, I really like those characters. I wonder what could happen next. And move to the next thing that could happen. So I've always been a TV show guy. I've always been a movie with sequels guy. Very few of the films that I watch, the mainstream films that I watch, are standalone. There's a whole different process, because now that I've done all the research and figured out what I'm going to do with the end of season 1 of Cold Stone Files, well, now I have to figure out what to do with the season 2, or what John is calling season 2.5, because that season 1's done. Okay, all that research is done. They're not going back to that case, but there's other things going on, and a lot of my fans, which is the weirdest thing I've ever said, there's mine, that I have fans, wanted me to put the next one in Savannah, Georgia. So there's also that. And so there's researching all that, because it's been so many years since I've been to Savannah, and the lore behind there, and Butler Island, and what went on with James Butler, or Pierce Butler, excuse me. So it's a continual amount of research. It's building a world Bible, which you don't do with a standalone book. You really don't want to do that on the third and fourth, and you really won't do that on the fifth book either. You really want to start that on the first one. Just throwing that out there. It's a whole different process. The few times that I've tried to write a standalone, I can't do it. And major kudos to people who can. But you always have to be able to you always have to be able to end it, but end it in a way where it can continue on. For me, that comes fairly easy. For some people, not. They're a one and done. But yeah, it's a completely black and white different process.
Theresa, what are your thoughts on?
It's totally different to write a standalone piece versus a series. I started way back in high school years ago, and I wrote
4 years ago, guys. She graduated 4 years ago.
Thank you, generous. I wrote individual novels, and I wrote 2 of them while I was in high school. They're terrible. They'll never see the light of day. But I came up reading horror, and in general, horrors are one and done, because either everybody dies or everybody barely makes it through, and the monster is inevitably vanquished in some way, even if it's not permanently. I learned writing book 2 of Caitlin Kelly. I did not know how to write a series, and I had to very quickly learn. And it was far more challenging than I thought, because I really wanted to have a very rich world and a very complicated narrative where, you know, the things that are going to go wrong in book 3 are telegraphed in book 2. And, you know, you might even see something that's going to go wrong in book 4 that shows up in book 1 or 2. And one of the really good things about being a writer, I think, is that sometimes your brain works on multiple levels without telling you what's going on. So I had gone back to book 1, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I need something. I need to pull a rabbit out of a hat to help me with this problem that I've encountered, and I can't go back and reinsert it because the book's already out, and I'm sitting here staring at this draft, and I'm like, there's got to be something. I found multiple things that I had just tossed into book 1 and 2 without really thinking about it, and it became the Hail Mary that I could use to drive it forward. So I've had to really focus on intentionally laying groundwork for things that I may or may not use, but they need to be there in case I have to reach back to them. And I have to be more careful about doing it intentionally rather than just relying on, you know, the animal brain back here to drop random things into the story that I can dig up later. One and done pieces are much easier simply because you don't have to go back and remember your own world building. You don't have to go back and remember what somebody's eye color was, or, you know, what the story about their first date was, or whatever the case may be. You're contained within that world for that one instance. But with the series, not only do you have to keep that history straight, but you have to build on it. You have to make it more complicated, because the more complicated it is, the more interesting it is.
And to piggyback what you were saying, you know, as far as me saying, for me, it's super difficult to write stuff that's standalone. That's totally an individual thing. Where you were saying it's easier for you to write a standalone because you don't have to go back. With me, the minute I finish a story, my brain starts working about what could happen with these characters next. Where could we go from here?
I think part of that may even be like what we grew up reading. Like if you read like epic fantasies, or, you know, stories that have multiple volumes in it, that's one thing. There was really only 1 or 2 series that I read as a kid that I was interested in pursuing the characters through multiple books, and that wasn't because they weren't interesting. It doesn't trigger my brain the way a one and done book does. Like, I can sit down and I can binge read Stephen King, and I would even say he's very loosely a one and done person because his world is so interconnected. But I would appreciate being completely sucked into that world, into that problem, and then moving on to something else. Like Solomon Rushdie is another one. He's written multiple books, and they take, for the most part, place in the contemporary world. But because each one is an encapsulated world in and of itself, you do a deep dive, and when you come up for air, you can reflect on it, and then it's done. You move on to the next thing. I guess I have commitment issues of being stuck with one series for too long.
See, I was raised on Ramona Quimby and Bunnicula, so I mean,
yeah, I read those too, but
series
I
is,
much
I
more
guess, is just an
appreciated.
ingrained thing.
When I was a kid, my mom would take us to the used bookstore because I read compulsively, and I would come home with the paper grocery bag of those trashy 80s horror novels. And they're all like slash and splash. They've got the metallic blood on the cover. They're all embossed. And I would go through those like tissues. I mean, I would just run through them so fast.
Mm-hmm.
But it was always that one and done. It was that intense hit. It was that change of style from one writer to another. There were very, very few that I would come back to seek out that voice again, because I just wanted something new and different every single time. And when I write, that's a lot of what I chase. Like, every one of my stories is a little different. Even looking at Caitlin 1, Caitlin 2, and Caitlin 3, they're very different in and of themselves.
And I'm looking, John's nodding along. So you have a different viewpoint with this, because you're not only the author, but you're a publisher. And I know series are probably better for you as a publisher than standalone, but I'll leave that up to you here.
Well, wearing my publisher hat, the science fiction, the fantasy market in particular, fantasy and urban fantasy, are driven by series. There are many more opportunities for standalone novels in horror and in science fiction. There aren't very many standalone fantasy and urban fantasy novels. That's just not how the market has developed in recent times. That being said, I've never intentionally started writing a series. Every series I've ever written started off as writing one book. I didn't go in, I wrote the Black Knight Chronicles because I thought a book about fat vampires would be funny. I wrote one Quincy Harker novella because I thought it would be fun. I wrote a Bubba the Monster Hunter short story because I needed something to sell. And then as people bought them, I wrote more of them. But I've never intentionally set out to write a series, which is why I do always end up going back and having someone create my world Bible 3 or 4 books in. Note, I didn't say that I do it, because I don't. I'll own that.
No, my wife does it.
Yeah, that's right. One thing that, when Theresa was talking, one thing it reminded me of was when A.J. Hartley was working on his second Steeplejack book. I remember him griping about the process because he wrote and sold Steeplejack, knowing in his mind that he was laying the groundwork for a trilogy. But when they picked up the trilogy, he was like, I'm going to have to draw a map of the city now, because I don't remember where these streets go. And that kind of stuff gets important. I turned in book 8 of the Black Knight Chronicles this year. In book 8, I started using a custom Google map to plot locations of things in the series. There's only going to be one more book. It's a 9-book series and it's ending. So yeah, the market decides whether or not I write standalones or whether I write series. I published a book last year called Raptor, which was a military science fiction novel. I had an idea. I wanted to write it. I enjoyed writing it. If it sold like gangbusters, it would be a series. It is not a series.
Now, going with that comment, your Black Knight Chronicles, you said, is ending after 9. Mm-hmm. Is that because sales, or you've reached the end of the arc?
I've actually reached the end of the second arc. When I originally created it, it was 1 book. And then I was like, okay, well, I'll write another book. And then I was like, okay, I might need to start having a plan. So I wrote a 3rd book, and I kind of had an idea. Then when I sold that series to Bellbridge Books, they bought 6 books. So I was like, okay, we'll make an arc that is 6 books long and will encompass the first 3 in that. So, because that's how they bought it. They bought the first 3 existing to be rebuilt, and then 3 new ones. Well, when we got to the end of, when I turned in book 6, they said, I don't remember who asked who first, but basically one of us said, you want to write more? And the other one said, you want more? And we agreed that they wanted more and I wanted to write more. So I created another 3-book arc. That series could have ended with 6 books and been perfectly fine. The story was done. But there were other stories to tell, and I figured I could wrap things up in a more final fashion with another 3-book arc. So yeah, I'm done with the story. By the time I finish with that, it's 2020. It'll be 2022 by the time book 9 releases. That'll be 13 years that I've been working on those characters. That's a long time. No, it's nothing compared to some folks. I mean, that's just the gap between 2 Pat Rothfuss novels. But Pat's not watching, but if he is, sorry, pal, love you. But, I mean, that's how long it takes me to bench press a Brandon Sanderson series. But for me and for urban fantasy, that's a good long run. And I'm not the same writer I was 10, 11 years ago, and I won't be the same writer 2 years from now as I am today. So why would I want to keep telling the same stories? I set myself up for a new trilogy in book 8. I introduced a character that in my head since book 3 has been the spin-off series. I've known for 9 years now what the spin-off is when I'm done with the Black Knight Chronicles. And Belbridge and I have already started talking about maybe doing more work together.
See, I'm kind of glad too that you brought up that Belbridge it was what influenced you to write the other 3 books, because you're the one who made season 2 of Coldstone Files happen, because you bought 4 novellas, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna write 4 novellas, and I'm one of those, like, there's going to be 3 books, or there's going to be this many books, and I'm done. And then you said, okay, cool, well, we'll talk about that. I can't remember what we were talking about, but you made the comment, okay, well, we'll talk about that with season 2. And I'm like, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was there that night. It was at a bar.
Oh, well, yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
I mean,
So,
yeah. Well, just like everything, the numbers came in on book 1. The book sold well. I was like, okay, well, I've broken his soul by now in edits, so I've got him housebroken by and large. May as well keep doing stuff with him.
I mean, Jason,
Swatting
you
with
could
a
always,
newspaper.
I went through so many newspapers working on book 2.
Jason, you could always do what me and Natanya do. We signed contracts for 4 books and then ended up writing 3, but the last one is the size of 2 books.
Yeah, and at some point you corrupted Les Gould too, by the way.
Yes!
I can't.
He signed for 4. And season 1 of the Peterson Apostles is 3 books, because
This is why they call me the evil twin.
See, I can't. I'm way
because
too
she's the
anal
original
retentive.
wordy bitch.
I am way too anal retentive for that, because when I sold him book 1, I already had book 2 written, and it was halfway through book 3.
Yeah, and then I
knew
told him, hey, stop working on book 3 because we're blowing up book 2.
Yeah.
All right.
But, you know, I just started today on edits for book 4, and it helps me that I know that Jason writes to a very tight window of his word count, because I know how much time it will take to edit. I know when I'm working about how many pages I can edit in a day and it's different. I'm currently working on a book of Jason's and a book of Stuart Jaffe's. I can edit a lot of pages of Stuart, because Stuart's written a lot of books. I can edit a Gail Martin novella in 2 days, because it needs a very light touch, because Gail's written a ton of books. Jason hasn't written as many, but I can edit about the same number of Jason pages in a day as I can Stuart pages in a day. But a first-time novelist, I can do about half.
Yeah.
And so knowing that Jason was going to send me a book that's about 125 manuscript pages, I was like, okay, I can do about 25 pages a day. That'll take me about a week to knock that book out. And that's about what I'll probably finish that book this weekend, and I'll finish Stuart's I may finish it earlier because I've got a little less on Stuart's left. So I'm doing 25 pages on each book per day.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So getting back to our stories, Theresa, what was something that surprised you either about this individual book or the series itself?
Well, with this book, it was kind of like working through therapy, because basically I torture Caitlin. I really wrecked her hard in this book, and a lot of what she was going through in terms of not being happy with what was going on in her work life, and having some struggles with mental health issues as far as like depression and anxiety, were very much things that I was going through. And on some level, I didn't really realize how much they were bothering me. I just knew that it was taking a really, really long time to get the words out for this book. And when I finished it, I told John, I'm like, this is gonna need a lot of work because it's a hot mess. And the conclusion was that it really wasn't, that it was that I was a hot mess dealing with this book, and it was coming out in the work. And I kind of intentionally did that, in that I wanted people to have some kind of, not necessarily a role model, but an example of somebody who is supposed to be at the top of their game, who is supposed to be the strong one, the one who fights through everything, but that is deeply challenged by what's going on in their head, and not have it completely destroy everything. I wanted to show people who have never been through that stuff what it actually feels like to fight not only whatever challenge you're facing in the real world, but all the challenges going on in your head, and how utterly exhausting that can be. And I feel like, based on some of the feedback that I've gotten already, I have done that. That was probably the most surprising thing, was just how many of my own battles I was fighting on that paper. Even going back through the edits that John had given me, which weren't extensive, it took a really long time to go back through it, simply because it was emotional work to read, because I had lived it so closely. And we had to push back the publication date just because I couldn't do the work of going through that book again very easily. And I hope that someone who reads this book and identifies with what Caitlin goes through sees somebody else who is able to reach out for the help that they need, and can learn to do that as well, because it's not worth suffering like that. And I hope it makes a difference to at least one person.
I think that your process for revising Caitlin 3 was probably similar to mine for revising Black Knight 5. I wrote the end of that book right after my mother died. And I sent it off to my editor and said, here's the deal. Here's the chapter that you're going to need to just tell me what to fix. I can't look at it again, but I'll do whatever it needs. And go. Because it was that kind of very personal, very intense scene. Needless to say, I didn't know when I plotted out that chunk of the arc that my mother was going to die while I was writing that book. I was fairly certain that she wasn't going to make it to see the end of the series, even when we thought it was going to be 6 books. But, you know, terminal illness does that shit. So it was very surprising that things happened to line up so perfectly that I got to use my fiction as therapy. But yeah, my revisions for that book were very long, because I had to go back through all of that, and I could only do a little bit at a time.
Yeah, I got through it very, very slowly. I could do like 3 or 4 pages at a sitting, and then I'd have to get up and do something else, and then come back to it and do 3 or 4 more pages, because it was just very difficult to read for me, because it was essentially like reading a history of some sort, because I knew what I poured into it. I knew what that felt like, and it was almost like reliving it.
Yeah.
So, John, for conspiracy theory, was there anything in that that surprised you? Or do you still get surprised with each story?
I get surprised by where books go. You'll never hear me say things like, the character took me somewhere else, because that's a load of crap. I'm writing the book. The characters do what I want. But I wrote that book in the summer of 2020. The world's on fire. We've gone through a lot of upheaval over the past 6 months. And I was writing and outlining this book right in the middle of it. What surprised me was how I had to figure out how to deal with the real world in my fiction. That's a challenge when you're writing urban fantasy. When you're writing things that are set in the real world's going to leak into that. The love interest and one of the major characters in the Quincy Harker series is a Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department detective. I watched on this screen that I'm talking to you on tonight, I watched the Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department ambush its own citizens and tear gas the shit out of people in using military level assault tactics. They hemmed people in, they shot from elevated positions, and I could not continue to put a positive face on that organization. I wouldn't. So this book got real political. Anybody who reads my work ought to know my politics. If not, check your basic reading comprehension. I might look like a giant pickup truck driving redneck. Oh wait, I am a giant pickup truck driving redneck. But yeah, my politics are pretty progressive. So what surprised me was the level of real world allegory that ended up in this book, because that's not something I do that often. But moving forward with an ongoing series, I'm in the same boat that everybody else who writes in the real world is dealing with, is how do we deal with the changed world of 2020? Mm-hmm. Right now, this book happens before everybody was sweating social distancing and quarantines and masks. The next book I can't dodge that with the next book. So got to see where we all shake out with all of our current circumstances. But that's going to impact all of my ongoing series, as it is for both of these guys too. That kind of stuff. Do these things exist in your world? That's something every writer I know who works in the real world is thinking about right now, you know?
And given the magnitude of everything that is going on, at some level, it's going to have to exist in some way, or you're essentially writing fantasy.
Right. And we are, but urban fantasy is theoretically grounded in our world.
Exactly.
So where's the divergence?
Yeah.
So those things, how much the real world bled into this book surprised me. Jason, and then my emotional reaction to the death in this book that I knew was coming. I was like, wow, that hit me harder than I thought. Yeah, y'all gonna hate me.
All right, Jason.
So I have, as far as the Coldstone Files, things with kids really piss me off. I talk a lot of shit, but you want me to swing at you? let's talk about child trafficking and say something positive about that whole shit circus. So for the for the first season, I'm having to research so much of that. And I mean, when you read the books, it's horror comedy. I mean, every time I read that newspaper scene, the whole room falls out. I broke Jeannie Adams with the newspaper scene. I have researched what really happens in child trafficking, and it's sick. I've seen things that I never want to see again. And unfortunately, I've had things verified about humanity that I really wish I was wrong. So far, season one's been pretty strong. That is why season two is going to be a little more, okay, it's a murder mystery kind of thing. So give me a break. Clockworks of War, I wrote that really early on. I wrote that in 2016. Back when the conversation of how much money is floating around in politics, and that's not a political stance. There's a whole lot of money floating around in politics, and so in that world, the corporations, the oligarchs, are the ones running the country, and they're very open about it, and they call themselves the oligarchy, and it's done. Book 2 and book 3, they find out real quick that the new president, there wasn't even an election. He just showed up one day and said, "Hey guys, I'm the president." And by the time book 3 rolls around and New Chicago is a war zone, it's hard for me to go back to that series, and I'm having to do that right now because I'm going through the audiobook process. Not because I wrote it while the things that are happening happen, because I wrote it before all of this shit went down. And book 3, especially Gaslit Revolution, frankly, it's kind of scary seeing the level of violence that's going on right now in the streets, and how, frankly, how driven everything is by the violence and by retaliation from one side or retaliation from the other, and just how horrific things can be. I wrote this, book 3 came out in 2018. And here we are in 2020, and we're all trapped in our houses, and the world is on fire. So now that my audiobook producer is working on book 3, going back through that and having to review what he's read so far, if you buy my book, even if you don't like the Clockworks of War, buy the audiobooks, because this dude is amazing. He's awesome. But going through book 3 has a whole new tone for me, and it reads more like a horror novel in a lot of ways. It really does. At the same time, Coldstone Files for me kind of holds dread that while I am taking a break from what is hard for me with the new one, I know my personality and I know my writing style, and all that means is that I'm fattening myself as an author for the slaughter. So book 5 will be it's a murder mystery formulaic episode of the series. And then book 6 is going to come out, and somebody's going to get kicked in the balls. And it's going to be me, and I'm taking the reader with me. So it's more of that oncoming dread. As far as integrating, the current situation that we're in with the pandemic and whatnot, I've consciously made a choice to not integrate that in my writing, because my belief is people are reading my stuff to get away from this crap and get away from what's going on for like 2 minutes. Just read something and pretend that things are still, you know, what we remember them being. I do plan to reference back to it once things settle down enough for me to feel like I can write it without feeling like I'm pouring rubbing alcohol on a freshly opened wound. But in the meantime, when I think about writing during the current situation, the first thing comes to my head is I got to figure out how I can get all my characters to Zoom call. And I can't make myself do that. That's probably some closed-mindedness on my part, and I'm perfectly willing to admit that. But I want people to read my shit and go, okay, cool. I had a good time with that, and I got to step out for a minute. And now I'm back, but anytime I want to step out, there's my stuff. There's John's stuff. There's Theresa's stuff. And I feel like I feel like our fan base would appreciate that more, frankly.
All right. Thank you. Next question, John. What is the best or worst advice you've gotten about writing?
Vampires are dead. Nobody buys vampire books anymore.
Is that best or worst? I can't figure it out.
Well, considering how many of you sold since then?
It can be the best advice I've ever ignored, or the worst advice I was ever given. Yeah, I was told that back in 2009, that nobody buys vampire books anymore. I've done okay.
So nobody is buying your book.
Right. Apparently that is a very popular name.
All right. Theresa.
Probably the best advice was write the book you want to read, because my tastes are kind of eclectic, I guess you could say. So sometimes when I write, it doesn't really fit into a neat, shiny box. Like I can't keep myself just strictly in the Bubba tone, had to play in Harker's Pool. So I write the book I want to read because there are other people like me who want to read it.
All right. And Jason.
So I know it sounds like I'm brown nosing a lot. I mean, I was mentored as a kid by Faith Hunter, and I'll be eternally grateful for the amount of time that she put into this kid who wanted the impossible. But Hartness actually gave me some awesome advice one day in his normal tone of, well, that's fucking stupid, just do it this way. And it was, have a words for later folder. So if you're writing something and you need a minute, it's like riding your horse and you're cantering along and everything's going smooth, and then the horse just suddenly goes, because he needs a minute, because you've been in the arena for an hour, damn it. As a writer, you might get to that same point. You're writing this really serious scene or this really serious book, and you need a minute just to do something stupid. And you write this off-the-wall scene, and don't delete that. Have a folder called Words for Later where you put that, because you may surprise yourself and get somewhere in your book where you can use that. If you look through my Dropbox, every book I write, I separate every chapter into its own file. That's the way I can't write one document. And then in that folder for that book, there is a folder called Words for Later with some of the goofiest stuff you will ever read, that at times I've been able to go back to and go, wait a minute, I can use that. Even if it's just a sentence, I can use that and insert it into the book. I've got my word count because yes, I am anal retentive like that. I want to do 1,000 words plus a day. But now I've also got something that I've already written that works really well for that scene, and I don't have to think about it. It's there already. I already did the work. It's done. So no matter what you write in your process, don't delete that. Don't waste those words. You might be able to recycle them and use those later. And even if it's not in that book, you might be able to use it in a later book. Those words will eventually fit somewhere. And if they don't, that goes back to the mentality that you should have as a construction worker. It's better to have it than not need it, than need it and not have it.
Perfect. And I think that's going to do it for today. I'm just going to go around one more time and ask you guys to tell us where people can find you on the social media. And I'll go ahead and start there with you, Jason.
Because you saw me drinking my beer, I appreciate that.
Of
I'm gonna
course.
hunt you. Okay. You can usually find me on Facebook, Espousing Bullshit, Jason Gilbert. And then you can find me, my author page, Jason Gilbert Author, because I'm creative like that. And one day I got super creative and created my website, jasonhgilbert.com, that I should probably update at some point. I do have a newsletter that once you go to the site you can sign up for, but I am going to remodel that. So go ahead and sign up, and when I do the new newsletter, I'll just move you over. And then you can check me out on Amazon, just put my name in, or if you want to check me out along with a whole bunch of other like super talented authors, go over to the Falstaff Books website. Even check out Falstaff Books on Amazon, and you'll find me stacked in and hanging out with some of the best talent in the industry.
Thank you. Theresa.
You can find my books on falstaffbooks.com. You can follow me on Amazon as well. I'm on Facebook and Twitter as Theresa Glover. The handles are a little different, but if you search it, you'll basically see my covers come up, so you'll know it's me. And I also write content for authorsessentials.net and hang out behind the scenes at Continual, pushing buttons and making things happen.
Exactly. And finally, John.
I am on all forms of social media as John Hartness. The best way for people to interact with me is through my Facebook group, which is John G. Hartness Books. That's the best way to get updates and all of the latest news and actually talk with other like-minded nerds. Also, you can find my stuff at falstaffbooks.com or at johnhartness.com or bellbridgebooks.com. So, there you
Perfect. All right, guys. Again, thank you for watching, and I want to thank everyone for coming in. See you guys next time.
go. Bye.